Hi again guys, and welcome to another car review, of course, in the world of GT Sport. This time a car which I actually quite like, even though I don't talk about it all that often, the Mercedes SLS AMG, but in particular the Gr.4 racing version. Now the GT3 gets a lot of attention, the street car kind of, not so much these days with the AMG GT, but the GT3 really steals the spotlight, and as I spoke about in that car's review, in Gran Turismo 6 even more so. It was one of the best all-round GT3 cars in the game. Now of course, with balance of performance, with equalised pricing, various other things, the more realistic performance for instance for top speed, a lot of those things have been neutralised in many of those OP vehicles, and now other vehicles have become OP instead. Now when it comes to Gr.4, of course this is an unknown quantity to some degree, although interestingly this car actually has a fair amount in common, visually at least, with the SLS Stealth Edition in GT6. That was the closest thing to this car, but unlike the Stealth Edition, I actually like this one. And also unlike that car, this one gets used a lot. There were some people who would use those stealth cars in GT6, but it wasn't exactly part of the mainstream racing scene, whereas of course Gr.3 and Gr.4 cars are hugely important to the FIA GTC events, and I've actually found in my time both in sport mode and just in regular lobbies that I might actually enjoy Gr.4 racing more than Gr.3, which is probably a bold statement to make, but cars like this are one of the reasons why I enjoy it so much, because the specs are good, they're not great, but they're good, but in Gr.4 it really comes down to the handling for me with a lot of these cars, because none of them are fast as such. Of course, they're Gr.4, they're more like touring cars than GT machines, but at the same time, the handling advantage of certain models, the Scirocco for instance with the front wheel drive, the Megane as well, some others too, it can make all the difference. And although of course straight line speed always factors in and certain cars will have an advantage over others, it doesn't factor in as much, I would argue, as in some other racing categories. Now this car being an exotic to begin with, and again this is a problem or a potential problem that I've mentioned before with these cars, that you very rarely, if ever, see in Gr.3, and that is that many of these cars in Gr.4 started life being much faster, somewhat ironically, than they are in these racing forms. And when I say faster, I mean predominantly in a straight line. A lot of them have a lot more power to begin with, a lot more torque to begin with, some of them are perhaps lighter, some are heavier. This is one of those. The power is heavily neutered compared to stock. What's a stock SLS? Like 570 horses, I think. This one's got 420 or just under. It's still pretty torquey for a Gr.4 car, 352 pound-feet, but it's not even like it's light either. It weighs 1,415 kilos, which is like a hefty sports car weight anyway. Now of course it's rear-wheel drive, so you don't have the kind of understeer that a Megane or a Scirocco could have, but at the same time you don't necessarily have the weight advantage that they could have either. Now I will say one of the reasons why I like the SLS so much is because it does not feel as heavy as it is. This thing is fantastic through corners, and it feels almost better to me actually than the GT3 car. The GT3 is of course faster, but one of the reasons why a certain car will sometimes be faster isn't necessarily to do with the handling. It can just be having more power or being quicker on the straights, whereas this, to me, it just feels right. The handling feels smooth, it's controlled. It does not, as I said, feel anywhere near 1,400 kilos. It feels more like 1,250 to me, which, if I recall correctly, I think actually might have been similar to what the Stealth model weighed, I think. But I could be wrong on that one, I probably am. It's not like I drove those Stealth cars a lot anyway. Now of course certain things are standardised, like the class, obviously, the price as well, 350 grand, and the SLS across the board is a strong contender. It's one of those cars that, like the McLaren 650S, is good, and it's often used, it's very popular, although the Gr.4 cars of the McLaren and the Mercedes don't tend to get as much love as their Gr.3 counterparts do. And again, not too surprising given that Gr.3, or GT3 in other words, is far more in their elements with that kind of power and weight than this is. This really is the territory that favours sedans and hatchbacks more, because they're coming into their element rather than being detuned. Now of course I haven't used every single Gr.4 car in the game in like a full season of racing or anything like that, so I can't fully speak to whether or not a certain car will dominate or I mean, it shouldn't, of course, that's the whole point of balance of performance, but for me, most of my Group 4 racing has been done in the Scirocco and a couple of others, so I do like to have those cars that seem to be underdogs but are actually a lot better. In fact, the Scirocco is deceptively good, the Megane is known for that as well. The Mercedes I've done more time against the computer with in AI events than I have in FIA stuff, or even sport mode. However, every time I drive this car, I do enjoy it. It's a very pleasant car to drive. As I said, I might even like it more than the GT3, and in terms of tuning, well, you could argue that even more so than Group 3, it feels almost pointless to tune a lot of these Group 4 cars because balance of performance changes them so much more than Group 3 does most of the time, because those Group 3 cars tend to still have a decent amount of power and the weight doesn't usually change a huge amount. Unless you're going on like an oval track, then they'll immediately bump you to like 800 horses. These cars though, they tend to be altered and modified through BOP quite a lot. The weight will be radically different sometimes, the power could be radically different, so tuning, I would argue at least, doesn't have as much importance. And so, you could make a strong argument that in Group 4, what a car is capable of straight out of the box is very important. Because it means that if the car's already good, if you already like the way it feels, then chances are you'll probably enjoy using it in a season, or in a race, or in sport mode. Whereas if you buy a car, for instance, that requires a lot of tuning to even get on with it, some people, for instance, find that way with the Ferrari, a very twitchy car, very slippery mid-engine rear-wheel drive layout. If you need to tune that car that heavily, then chances are you're probably not going to like it with balance of performance, because they don't really let you do anything to it, so you're stuck with whatever BOP makes the car feel like. So if you've already got a car that feels good, chances are it'll stay good. If you want something that's more of a challenge, well then of course I'd recommend your Huracans, potentially, even though the Huracan's pretty good in Group 4, the Ferrari, the aforementioned Ferrari of course, maybe some others too, perhaps a Veyron. This, not so much. I would say that the SLS falls somewhere in the middle, maybe high middle of the pack to me. I'd give it like a 4 out of 5 in the rankings overall, like second highest, because it's not dominating from what I've seen, but it's good, it's strong, it's got a decent enough amount of power, a good amount of torque. The weight is high, but it doesn't feel it, which is good. And unlike something like a Nissan GTR, it doesn't feel like this massive thing that you're piloting around the track. Now, of course, the GTR is great, but the SLS could easily feel worse, because the GTR starts with all-wheel drive, it's got a ton of tech helping out the handling, and its entire life it's been a pretty big car. The SLS is kind of this new thing for Mercedes. It does not carry much over from the SLR, so it could have easily been completely messed up by what they've done to it in Group 4. But it's not. It feels good. Now, as I said, I can't guarantee whether or not you'll dominate events in it, but this is definitely one of those Group 4 cars that I would recommend looking into. If you're looking for a surprisingly beginner-friendly, very smooth approach at a Group 4 machine, then the SLS is worth checking out. Might not be the fastest thing around, but it definitely won't be the slowest. As I said, kind of the high-end middle of the grid. But overall, that's it for my review. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.